Hi, so what I want to talk about in this tutorial are the Amherst or Pioneer Valley camera trap data. Some of you guys may have actually collected some of these camera trap data if you've taken the wildlife habitat management class, or you might have been involved in some of Professor Warren's or Professor Fuller's work actually analyzing some of the camera trap, which is pretty fun. So here is one of our data sets. This is the camera trap data from 2017. And then there's also camera trap data dating back to 2012. I think there might be like a spring in that one as well. In both cases of this, we are in luck because we see latitude and longitude clearly labeled over here. And we know that lat lon are in decimal degrees. And so the projection of these data in both cases should be a geographic coordinate system. So the only thing that we have to do is to pick a reasonable datum in order to display it. One of the things that's kind of interesting, always interesting about dealing with other people's data is kind of the different assumptions that when you create data, you kind of assume, well, I know what this means, so everybody is going to understand what this means, right? But one of the reasons that data science really recommends adding metadata tabs or some sort of README information is because sometimes it can be really hard for other people to know or interpret, well, like what do these different things mean? Like land use, for example, right? I mean, I could guess that U maybe means urban, but I don't know about these other ones. I don't know what the lore PR means. I can pretty well interpret, zeros and ones and other numbers as the number of individuals that are seen. But I actually, since I study plants and not animals, have pretty much no idea what any of the four-letter codes mean. I mean, four-letter codes are generally the first two letters of the genus and the first two letters of the species. So, for example, that one I think is the gray squirrel because I looked it up because it had a lot of data in it. So I figured it was something common. But for a bozo like me who doesn't know anything about animals, like it would be nice to have some metadata that tells me what these different things are. And I will say something similar happens in this data sheet. So there is a metadata tab in here. But one of the things that I notice is that these values are not, whole integers. So this number is clearly not representative of the number of bears that were observed at this point. And when I look in the metadata, it just tells me bear means bear, basically, but not what the actual numeric value in this column is. So I'm going to guess that probably this numeric column is number of individuals divided by the total of trap nights, so individuals per trap night, but I don't know that for 100% sure. So that's just a lesson for you guys. Anytime you're creating data, create some metadata to go along with it and explain what's in your columns in what seems to you to be excruciatingly pedantic detail, but will really help other people later on who are trying to interpret what you've done. All right, so back to GIS, lat, lon, in both of these, fantastic. So we're ready to go. Well, we're almost ready to go. The other problem is both of these are Excel tables. My version of GIS of ArcMap 10.6 is not playing happily with Excel files right now. So I'm going to do a save as on this. I'm going to save this in my temp directory as a CSV, comma separated values, which GIS is generally okay with. And it's going to tell me it can only save the sheet, but that's okay. I don't want anything but the sheet that has lat lon in it. All right, so over to GIS. First thing is I've already downloaded, it's a little large, this Landy 2005 polygon from MassGIS. And I changed the symbology to show you all of the different land cover classes that are mapped in there in whatever this random color scheme is that GIS came up with, different hues. I'm going to refresh my temp directory so that I can pull in my mammal camera trap data. And it'll be down at the bottom here. Back to lab 5, remember we do a display XY. X field is longitude, Y field is latitude. I always need to move my hand when figuring that stuff out. Helps me out. The other thing though, remember we already looked at those XY data, the latitude and longitude, and we figured out that they were in units of decimal degrees, and therefore the coordinate system should be a geographic coordinate system, not a projected coordinate system. GIS is trying to help us out here by saying, well, that's the coordinate system that this land use layer that you've added to my data frame, that's the coordinate system of it. Maybe that's what you're looking for. But it turns out that GIS, in trying to help us, is actually going to mislead us if we just clicked OK there, because we know it's not a projected coordinate system. We just need to pick a reasonable datum like NAD 83 for the US, the North American datum. This is all we should see is just geographic coordinate system. I was trying to highlight this part. Geographic coordinate system, you don't want to see anything that says projected in here. If you have anything that says projected in the description, then it's a projected coordinate system of some sort, even if it's built on top of a geographic coordinate system with this datum. Okay, so let's see those. And voila, we have a bunch of points happily falling in the Amherst area. You guys can see the quabbin over here, so we know we're roughly in the right location. It is, yeah, this is a large layer of land use, so it's taking a little while to draw. Remember, this is an event layer. It's not actually data yet. So if we want the data, we have to do a data export data and save this as whatever this is, 2017. Bring it in. And so I'm going to, I'm actually going to turn off the land use so that it doesn't take such a long time to draw. I don't need this anymore, my event layer. I don't need my CSV anymore because I've turned that into this nice point file. I'm not really into that. Wow, I could make them all matches. That's kind of exciting. I'm just going to make them big green dots for now rather than matches, even though I'm kind of into that. I'm going to open the attribute table just because I want to make sure that my data came in the way I expected them to, and this table looks pretty similar to what the table looked like. Should look identical, in fact, to what the table looked like in Excel. Okay, so when we're dealing with the camera trap data, one of the things that we're often asked or asking is there a relationship between the number of times that we see a certain species and the surrounding land use, right? So do we see gray squirrels, for example, in areas that have more of a residential or urban footprint? Do we see bears in areas that have more of a forested footprint, whatever that is, right? Part of, and so it depends which species on here you're interested in analyzing. You might be interested in analyzing the Shannon diversity or species richness or Simpson's diversity, or a couple of different species on here. Any of those would be totally fine. But depending on the species that you're after, you might have a different buffer, basically buffer distance, of where you think land use is going to be important in terms of influencing the abundance of that species, right? So for example, and for this type of project, we can just like make up some numbers basically, but let's say a squirrel, might be influenced by stuff that's going on, you know, a few hundred meters away from it, let's say like half a kilometer, right? 500 meters. Whereas, you know, I can't remember if there were bears in this particular data set. There was in the other, okay, there's a bear, right? So a bear is probably going to be influenced by things at a larger scale than that because it moves around more than a chipmunk or a squirrel does, right? So one recommendation that I have is to choose a species that has a lot of data, right? So if you choose a bobcat and a bobcat was never seen anywhere, or cats apparently like we don't have in this data set either, then you're not going to find any interesting results because you have no data to work with, right? Or the fisher cat, right? You know, like, I mean, super cool species, but was only observed 3 times in this data set, so we're just not going to get a lot of information to compare. So I'm going to go with gray squirrel because I'm a squirrel fan. And I'm going to say that a squirrel is probably that, let's go with the 500 meters in terms of, you know, like how much land use a squirrel cares about. So again, taking a step back, what we're trying to do is for each of these points, and these are points, I made them kind of big, but they are actually points. I'll make them matches again, just because that's awesome. We have a specific location, and at that point, we know how many squirrels there were, right? And so our hypothesis is that areas with more squirrels might be have surrounding land use with more residential land use, for example. So first thing that we need to do is get our buffer going, right? Because we need a shape, polygon, to represent this area of land use that we think is going to be important to our squirrel. So we want to make a buffer around the camera traps. And I'm just going to call this camera trap. Make sure that I have the distance in here because I am forgetful. We also want to make sure that we keep a dissolve type of none here. So we actually do want all of that input information, the original information, including the numbers of squirrels observed at that specific location. We want that to come through and be part of the polygon that's going to be the end result here. If you did a dissolve type of all, then we would just get a bunch of circles, basically, but not the key attribute information that we need of numbers of squirrels at those points. All right, while that buffer is operating, I'm going to just scan down my list of land uses and notice that there are a bunch of ones in here that have something to do with residential. So actually, I think I'm gonna keep this just focused on residential area. And I'm gonna export, basically I'm gonna create a subset of my land use layers that is just the residential areas. So I can do that with my select by attributes. I want the description. And then I'm just going to need to find all of these high density residential, or because we want multiple things, low density residential, or medium density residential. There was like a very low density residential. You guys can do, so you can do this however you want to do this, right? You know, this is your project. You get to decide, you know, what you hypothesize matters to the squirrel, okay? So that should select all of these things. We can see that there are 204,000 features selected. I'm going to, we can see those if we open the attribute table, should be all those things related to residential. And so I'm just going to do a data export data and create a new, sun's getting in my eyes. I'm looking like a ghost now. So this is residential. Okay, and then I'll take a minute to spit out. Okay, I just moved my camera around so that I wasn't blinded by the sun quite so much. So it's just created this new layer of residential area, right? We can turn that on and sort of see where that exists relative to our flaming squirrel points. All right, so we don't actually need the points anymore. We're just interested in the polygons and where they might overlap with residential areas. And I can make these hollow and the outlines red or something like that, just so we can see them a little bit better. Okay. So how do we get the information from one place into another, right? So in this case, we might want both the information from the camera traps, right? All of our attributes, including how many squirrels there were or the squirrel density or whatever it is. We might also want the information in residential because there's these different levels of residential that we've pulled in to this information, right? So in that case, what I'm going to do is what's called an intersect. So an intersect is the overlap between two different things. The shape of it is going to look exactly like a clip, but the difference is that you're also going to get the attributes of both of or all of, it could be multiple layers, all of the layers that you put into an intersect. And we want all of that attribute information. So I've got my camera trap buffers, I've got my residential, and I'm going to call this camera trap 500 and residential. Seems like an apt name. Okay, off we go. And so as we would have expected, here's what the overlap between those two different things looks like, right? You can kind of see the edges of those buffers that I created. The attribute table is going to look a little crazy because it has both the attribute information from the from the camera trap, as well as the information from the residential layer, right? So in this case, we have all of these different residential land types, and they might get repeated. So for example, this is like, here, let's make sure this is sorted. Here's camera 1, right? So camera 1 has 12 different parcels within that 500 meter buffer. You can go find camera 1. So here are the edges, here's the residential edges that are within 500 meters of camera 1. And camera 1, remember, still has the same proportion of gray squirrels in it, right? That hasn't changed, even though there are now 12 entries associated with it. The reason there are 12 entries is because there were a bunch of different parcels, several parcels of multifamily residential, medium, high, low, very low, all of the different residential categories, in fact, are within 500 meters of camera 1, including multiple polygons that started out in our land use 2005 of this multifamily residential with different areas associated with them, right? So all of these are associated with the same squirrel density, but I want to combine them in some way that is going to make sense for me to be able to analyze later on. So one thing I can do is just consider all the residential things to be equal. So, okay, that's easy. I'm just going to say, because I already extracted, selected and subset just my residential stuff, I can instead now, just measure by camera, right? Like I can summarize by camera. One other piece of information though that I probably want is this area piece, right? So this area, remember when I don't know what the units are because that came from my original spatial database. So I never trust GIS, especially in shapefile form. So I'm going to add my own area calculation, and I'm going to call it area in square meters, and we'll make it floating point, and then we will calculate it again. So this original area field, and it's nice, select square meters. This original one refers to the total polygon from my original residential layer, which came from Landy's 2005, right? But I just intersected that with my 500-meter buffers around the cameras. And so this might have been the original value of that polygon of multifamily residential, but now I've cut it back to be just within 500 meters, and so it's smaller. So this is the actual area within the 500-meter buffer. So this, I'm just going to delete. Think about it anymore. I don't want to confuse myself. I really don't care about the length. Okay, so here's my final area in square meters, and what I want to know is what's the total residential land area within each of these camera traps. So that is our handy summarize tool. So you can see that all of these are the same camera name, and it's important now that we choose the right column to summarize by, because we want to be able to later join this back to the original camera traps data set so that we can compare it to the numbers of squirrels, right? So this has an FID associated with it, but FIDs are kind of sketchy to use as join values because they can change depending on the data set. This looks like a way better column to use for our summary because that looks consistent. 0, 1, 2, 3, eco, I recognize those values. So I am going to make sure I clear the selection, otherwise it'll only work on the selected thing. We will use our fancy summarize tool. So summarize, remember, at its minimum is just going to count up the number of residential parcels within that 500-meter buffer. So it would say there's 12 or whatever the number is, camera trap or residential parcels for eco 0, 2, and so on. But there's one other handy thing that we can do, which is since we have area in square meters, we can tell it also sum up the area. And so a DBase table would work, text file would work, and I just messed this up a second ago, so I'm gonna call it version 2. Okay, and I want to see it. Here it is. All right, so now I've got my camera name. There were 12 for that camera, 2 for this parcels of residential, right? Really confusing name here. So if we wanted to remember that this is parcels of residential or polygons of residential, then then we would want to, okay, so this is a table, so we can't actually do anything in GIS with it. We could change the name of this to be parcels residential, just so that it's easier to remember later on. That's not a permanent change, it's just the annotation to it. So what's important here is that we've got a range of area, everything from not much residential area surrounding camera 3 to tons of residential surrounding camera 19. Camera name, right? So what we want is to bring in that % residential or area of residential into this. That's our handy join. If you guys remember, these are using tools that you learned back in Lab 2, but hey, just because it was Lab 2 doesn't mean they aren't really useful tools. we're going to use camera name, version 2, and camera name is in there again. And so now once that's joined in here, we should see that the total area in square meters is in here. There are actually a couple of cameras, it looks like, in here that have no residential land surrounding them, and so they got values of 0. Here's a case where some area meter squared, I know in my head right now that that is total area of total residential area within 500 meters, right? But I will not remember that tomorrow. So I'm going to call it residential area in square meters. This, I'm just adding a new field. Okay, fine. And I'm going to use the handy field calculator. And I know that that last thing was all the way at the end, some area square meters. And I'm just going to copy the values from one to another. And that generated a couple of warnings, basically because it had no data values in here. And it was just like, I just set this to 0, hope that's okay. And I'm like, that is okay, GIS, I like what you did. Okay, so now in this table in GIS, I have the total area of residential, and I have the, wherever my squirrel is, G squirrel, where'd you go? G squirrel. And I've got my density of the G squirrel, right? So let us export my table. So squirrel versus res. I don't care to have that in GIS because where I want it is back in Excel, and I want to open that file, browse for it. Excel will start out, first it's in the wrong folder. Excel will only show you Excel files or things that are Excel file-like or something. I don't know what SHP is to Excel. Not helpful here because we just saved that as a text file. So you need to tell it to look for everything. And then we need to remember that it was squirrel vres was the file that we wanted. Then Excel will be like, what kind of file is this? And you say, oh, look, there are commas separating all of these values. So it must be commas or tabs separating them. And it is commas, not tabs. And then we click next and finish. And now we have our data sheet plus that handy area in square meters, right? All right, so I was just trying to figure out why there's blanks over here at the end here, and I think it's because they actually should be zeros, and for whatever reason, these final zeros didn't copy in. So these are the, I went back and looked in GIS table, and these cameras were the ones that had 0 residential land around them. So I'm just adding zeros to here to keep me from going crazy, basically. All right, and we want the total area here and G squirrel here. And basically, you know, if you put this stuff into Excel and you tell it to insert a scatter plot, then it's automatically going to put in, you know, those two axes in here. And in this case, I probably actually want those axes to be reversed. So I want, rather than squirrel density predicting area, I want area predicting squirrel density, right? So I can do that by clicking on them and reversing the letters here, or I can drag some stuff around until, oops, till I am, actually, I guess maybe it's easiest to just do this. So A versus B. So when you do this, put your X in the first column and your Y in the second column, and you will be happier than I am. Okay, so then this should be land area predicting squirrels, or area residential, sorry, predicting squirrels. You know, there are, so you can also do a correlation analysis. So Pearson correlation is the correlation coefficient between this and this. Voila, there is basically no correlation between numbers of squirrels or density of squirrels and area of residential land within 500 meters. So that was kind of interesting. Hopefully yours shows something a little bit more interesting than the squirrel analysis, but that is a place to start. I'll just show you one other thing, which is sort of like if you want to get fancy with this, you don't have to subset out just the residential land. You can instead do an intersect between your buffers and the original land use polygon. I'm just going to dump that out to a default geodatabase. Okay, so that took a little bit of time to process, but here we are with all of our camera trap buffers and lots of information now about all of the different types of land use within each of those. So if you wanted to rummage around a little bit more in terms of, you know, what's the total area, and I would need again to add an area and square meters on here so that I can recalculate that later on. Let's just, for argument's sake, calculate it on top of this area. So we've recalculated those since I clipped or intersected a bunch of them. Now I have two things that I'd like to summarize against. One is the land use description and the other is the camera trap name, right? Because I want to know what is the total land area of all of the different land uses surrounding camera 1. So that is a new tool, but it's similar to summarize. It's called summary statistics here. And basically we have our camera trap data, camera traps, blah, blah, buffer 5001. Yep, for 5002 is what it's gonna spit out. Good. Our statistics field, so this is what we want to generate some basic statistics. Is going to be area. That's the thing that I just recalculated. And what I want is the sum. So this little blank space is something that you can actually click on. The sum of all the cases, all the fields that are the same across both camera name and our land use description. LUO5 desk. Okay. This will hopefully make more sense when we look at the summary table of 5002. So here's camera 1. Camera 1 had 2 parcels that were brushland successional, 4 that were cropland, 5 that were forest, 7 that were forested wetland, 3, etc. You probably get the gist of that. Those 2 brushland successional land covers surrounding camera 1 had a total area of 4,564.9 square meters, right? So if your hypothesis is not, you know, if you wanted to work through multiple different hypotheses and you just wanted to have all the data in one sheet, and then later on you can subset this into, you know, how many of these are residential, how many of them are forest types, etc., then this is how you get all of the information in. Summary statistics is your friend. So hopefully that helps as a place to get started with the camera trap data, whether that's the 2012 data or the 2017 data. Have a fun hypothesis, choose your buffer size, and get to intersecting.